The Problems of Philosophy, Chapter 13, Knowledge, Error, and Probable Opinion. The question as to what we mean by truth and falsehood, which we considered in the preceding chapter, is of much less interest than the question as to how we can know what is true and what is false. This question will occupy us in the present chapter. There can be no doubt that some of our beliefs are erroneous. Thus, we are led to inquire what certainty we can ever have that such and such a belief is not erroneous. In other words, can we ever know anything at all? Or do we merely sometimes, by good luck, believe what is true? Before we can attack this question, we must, however, first decide what we mean by knowing, and this question is not so easy as might be supposed. At first sight, we might imagine that knowledge could be defined as true belief. When what we believe is true, it might be supposed that we had achieved a knowledge of what we believe, but this would not be in accord with the way in which the word is commonly used. To take a very trivial instance, if a man believes that the late Prime Minister's last name begins with a B, he believes what is true, since the late Prime Minister was Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman. But if he believes that Mr. Balfour was the late Prime Minister, he will still believe that the late Prime Minister's last name begins with a B. Yet, this belief, though true, would not be thought to constitute knowledge. If a newspaper, by intelligent anticipation, announces the result of a battle before any telegram giving the result has been received, it may, by good fortune, announce what afterwards turns out to be the right result, and it may produce belief in some of its less experienced readers. But in spite of the truth of their belief, they cannot be said to have knowledge. Thus it is clear that a true belief is not knowledge when it is deduced from a false belief. In like manner, a true belief cannot be called knowledge when it is deduced from a fallacious process of reasoning, even if the premise from which it is deduced are true. If I know that all Greeks are men, and that Socrates was a man, and I infer that Socrates was a Greek, I cannot be said to know that Socrates was a Greek, because although my premise and conclusion are true, the conclusion does not follow from the premise. But are we to say that nothing is knowledge except what is validly deduced from true premise? Obviously, we cannot say this. Such a definition is at once too wide and too narrow. In the first place, it is too wide because it is not enough that our premise should be true. They must also be known. The man who believes that Mr. Balfour was the late Prime Minister may proceed to draw valid deductions from the true premise that the late Prime Minister's name begins with a B, but cannot be said to know the conclusions reached by these deductions. Thus, we shall have to amend our definition by saying that knowledge is what is validly deduced from known premises. This, however, is a circular definition. It assumes what we already know what is meant by known premises. It can, therefore, at best define one sort of knowledge, the sort we call derivative, as opposed to intuitive knowledge. We may say derivative knowledge is what is validly deduced from premises known intuitively. In this statement, there is no formal defect, but it leaves the definition of intuitive knowledge still to seek. Leaving on one side for the moment the question of intuitive knowledge, let us consider the above suggested definition of derivative knowledge. The chief objection to it is that it unduly limits knowledge. It constantly happens that people entertain a true belief which has grown up in them because of some piece of intuitive knowledge from which it is capable of being validly affirmed, but from which it has not, as a matter of fact, been inferred by any logical process. Take, for example, the beliefs produced by reading. If the newspapers announce the death of the king, we are fairly well justified in believing that the king is dead, since this is the sort of announcement which would not be made if it were false, and we are quite amply justified in believing that newspapers assert that the king is dead. But here, the intuitive knowledge upon which our belief is based is knowledge of the existence of sense data derived from looking at the print which gives the news. This knowledge scarcely raises into consciousness, except in a person who cannot read easily. A child may be aware of the shapes of letters and pass gradually and painfully to a realization of their meaning, but anybody accustomed to reading passes at once to what the letters mean, and is not aware, except on reflection, that he has derived this knowledge from the sense data called seeing the printed letters. Thus, although a valid inference from the letters to their meaning is possible, and could be performed by the reader, it is not in fact performed, since he does not, in fact, perform any operation which can be called logical inference. Yet it would be absurd to say that the reader does not know that the newspaper announces the king's death. We must therefore admit as derivative knowledge whatever is the result of intuitive knowledge, even if by mere association, provided there is a valid logical connection, and the person in question could become aware of this connection by reflection. There are in fact, many ways beside logical inference by which we pass from one belief to another. The passage from the print to its meaning illustrates these ways. These ways may be called psychological inference. We shall, then, admit that psychological inference means obtaining derivative knowledge, provided there is a discoverable logical inference which runs parallel to the psychological inference. This renders our definition of derivative knowledge less precise than we could wish, since the word discoverable is vague. It does not tell us how much reflection may be needed in order to make this discovery, but in fact, knowledge is not a precise conception. It merges into probable opinion, as we shall see more fully in the course of the present chapter. A very precise definition, therefore, should not be sought, since any definition must be more or less misleading. The chief difficulty in regard to knowledge, however, does not arise over derivative knowledge, but over intuitive knowledge. So long as we are dealing with derivative knowledge, we have the test of intuitive knowledge to fall back upon. But in regard to intuitive beliefs, it is by no means easy to discover any criterion by which to distinguish some as true and some as erroneous. In this question, it is scarcely possible to reach any very precise result. All our knowledge of truths is infected with some degree of doubt, and a theory which ignores this fact would be painfully wrong. Something may be done, however, to mitigate the difficulties of this question. One theory of truth, to begin with, supplies the possibility of distinguishing certain truths as self-evident in a sense which ensures infallibility. When a belief is true, we said, there is a corresponding fact in which several objects of the belief form a single complex. The belief is said to constitute knowledge of this fact, provided it fulfills those further somewhat vague conditions which we have been considering in the present chapter. But in regard to any fact beside knowledge constituted by belief, we may also have the kind of knowledge constituted by perception, taking this word in the widest possible sense. For instance, if you know the hour of the sunset, you can at that hour know the fact that the sun is setting. This is knowledge of the fact by way of knowledge of truths. But you can also, if the weather is fine, look to the west and actually see the setting sun. You then know the same fact by the way of knowledge of things. Truth in regard to any complex fact, there are theoretically two ways in which it may be known. One, by means of judgment, in which its several parts are judged to be related as they are in fact related. Two, by means of acquaintance, in which the complex fact itself, which may in a large sense be called perception, though it is by no means confined to objects of the senses. Now, it will be observed that the second way of knowing a complex fact, the way of acquaintance, is only possible when there really is such a fact, while the first way, like all judgment, is liable to error. The second way gives us the complex whole, and is therefore only possible when its parts do actually have that relation which makes them combine to form such a complex. The first way, on the contrary, gives us the parts and the relation severally, and demands only the reality of the parts and the relation. The relation may not constitute those parts in that way, and yet the judgment may occur. It will be remembered at the end of chapter 11, we suggested that there might be two kinds of self evidence, one giving absolute guarantee of truth, and the other only a partial guarantee. These two kinds can now be distinguished. We may say that truth is self-evident in the first and most absolute sense when we have acquaintance with the fact which corresponds to the truth. When Othello believes that Desdemona loves Cassio, the corresponding fact, if his belief were true, would be Desdemona's love for Cassio. This would be a fact with which no one could have acquaintance except Desdemona. Hence, in the sense of self-evidence that we are considering, the truth that Desdemona loves Cassio, if it were a truth, could only be self-evident to Desdemona. All mental facts and all facts concerning sense data have this same privacy. If there is only one person to whom they can be self-evident in our present sense, since there is only one person who can be acquainted with the mental things or the sense data concerned. Thus, no fact about any particular existing thing can be self evident to more than one person. On the other hand, facts about universals do not have this privacy. Many minds may be acquainted with the same universals, hence, relation between universals may be known by acquaintance to many different people. In all cases where we know by acquaintance a complex fact consisting of certain terms in a certain relation, we say that the truth of these terms are so related that has the first or absolute kind of self evidence, and in these cases, the judgment that the terms are related must be true. Thus, this sort of self evidence is an absolute guarantee of truth. But although this sort of self evidence is an absolute guarantee of truth, it does not enable us to be absolutely certain in the case of any given judgment that the judgment is in question true. Suppose we first perceive the sun shining, which is a complex fact, and then we proceed to make the judgment the sun is shining. In passing from perception to judgment, it is necessary to analyze the given complex fact. We have to separate out the sun and shining as constituents of the fact. In this process, it is possible to commit an error. Hence, even where a fact has first or absolute kind of self evidence, a judgment believed to correspond to the fact is not absolutely infallible, because it may not really correspond to the fact. But if it does correspond in the sense explaining to the preceding chapter, then it must be true. The second sort of self evidence will be what belongs to judgments in the first instance, and is not derived from direct perception of a fact as a single complex whole. This kind of self evidence will have degrees, from the very highest degree down to a bare inclination in favor of the belief. Take, for example, the case of a horse trotting away from us along a hard road. At first, our certainty that we hear the hoofs is complete. Gradually, if we listen intently, there comes a moment when we think perhaps it was imagination, or the blind upstairs, or our own heartbeats. At least we think, at last we become doubtful whether there was any noise at all. Then we think we no longer hear anything, and at last we know we no longer hear anything. In this process, there is continual gradation of self evidence, from the highest degree to the least, not in the sense data themselves, but in the judgments based on them. Or again, suppose we are comparing two shades of color, one blue and one green. We can be quite sure that they are different shades of color, but if the green color is gradually altered to be more and more like the blue, becoming at first a blue-green, and then a green-blue, then blue, there will be a moment when we are doubtful whether we can see any difference, and then a moment when we know that we cannot see any difference. The same thing happens in tuning a musical instrument, or in any other case where there is a continuous gradation. Thus, self evidence of this sort is a matter of degree, and it seems plain that higher degrees are more to be trusted than lower degrees. In derivative knowledge, our ultimate premise must have some degree of self evidence, and so must their connection with the conclusions deduced from them. Take, for example, a piece of reasoning in geometry. It is not enough that the axioms from which we start should be self evident, it is necessary also that at each step in the reasoning, the connection of the premise and the conclusion should be self evident. In difficult reasoning, this connection has often only just a very small degree of self evidence, hence, errors of reasoning are not improbable where the difficulty is great. From what has been said, it is evident that, both as regards intuitive knowledge and as regards derivative knowledge, if we assume that intuitive knowledge is trustworthy in proportion to the degree of its self evidence, there will be a gradation in trustworthiness from the existence of noteworthy sense data to the simpler truths of logic and arithmetic, which may be taken as quite certain, down to judgments which seem only just more probable than their opposites. What we firmly believe, if it is true, is called knowledge, provided it is either intuitive or inferred, logically or psychologically, from intuitive knowledge which it follows logically. What we firmly believe, if it is not true, is called error. What we firmly believe, if it is neither knowledge nor error, and also what we believe hesitatingly, because it is or is derived from something which has not the highest degree of self evidence, may be called probable opinion. Thus, the greater part of what would commonly pass as knowledge is more or less probable opinion. In regard to probable opinion, We can derive great assistance from coherence, which we rejected as the definition of truth, but may be used as a criterion. A body of individually considered probable opinions, if they are mutually coherent, become more probable than any one of them would be individually. It is this way that many scientific hypotheses require their probability. They fit into a coherent system of probable opinions and thus become more probable than they would be in isolation. The same thing applies to general philosophical hypotheses. Often, in a single case, such hypotheses may seem highly doubtful, while yet, when we consider the order and coherence which they introduce into a mass of probable opinion, they become pretty much certain. This applies in particular to such matters as the distinction between dreams and waking life. If our dreams, night after night, were as coherent with one another as our days, we should hardly know whether to believe the dreams or waking life. As it is, the test of coherence condemns the dreams and confirms the waking life. But this test, though it increases probability where it is successful, never gives absolute certainty unless there is certainly at some point in the coherent system. Thus, the mere organization of probable opinion will never by itself transform it into indubitable knowledge.